Hi everyone. So this is the first lecture of the first module of our online class. Um, this lecture is going to get into sort of the basics of the sociological perspective. There are probably many of you taking this class who have never had a sociology class before, or maybe it's been a while since you took intro. So this will be just a quick primer on sort of the basics of sociology and then get into a little bit of the history of medical sociology and what medical sociology is all about. And so if you have never taken a sociology class, you might wonder what sociology is, or you might have a sense that sociology is kind of about the study of people, but like that's also sort of confusing because that's what psychology is. So I'm going to break it down for you and sort of help you distinguish those two perspectives. So one way to think about sociology is that sociologists are all about debunking this myth of individualism. Okay, so in America, we have this focus on what is called rugged individualism. And what this means is, we have this idea that Americans, like, we work hard, we're going to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, we're going to support ourselves, we're going to do everything ourselves. And if we work hard and we, put all of our effort into everything, we're going to live a great and happy and prosperous life. However, what sociologists point out is that we do not live in isolation. So any successes that we have or decisions that we make that lead us to those successes, we don't do that completely on our own. Sociologists are really focused on what are the things in our social life and our social environment that contribute to us making these kinds of decisions and having these kinds of successes. So for example, consider your decision to go to college. Many students don't know what to say when I ask them, why did you come to college? Because the common response is, I didn't have a choice. But like, what does that mean? Let's break it down. So first of all, your family probably encouraged you to go. That's a form of social support, or, like it could be a form of social pressure if your parents are like my parents that told me you're going, the end. But regardless of the kind of influence your parents had, it's still a social influence, right? The family is something that everybody has. It looks a little bit different for everybody, but it's something that everyone has. And so the family is seen by sociologists as one kind of social institution. It serves a purpose. It raises children, it socializes children to be adult members of society. And so family encourages us to make the decision to go to college. You also recognize when you make the decision or not, you just say you're going to college. When you do that, you may also be recognizing that the economy is kind of tough right now for people without a college degree, right? The economy is another social institution and it's imposing constraints on you. Like if you don't go to college, you're not going to do as well. So the economy has rules and patterns, and you know these things. You know that people who don't have a college degree are less likely to do well than people who do. And so using your knowledge of the rules and the patterns of this particular social institution, the economy, that also influenced your choice to attend, because my guess is that you have a particular goal in mind, or you, in terms of your job, or you want to like make money. You might also have decided on North Central College in particular because you wanted to come to a small college rather than a large college, because maybe you feel that the size of a small campus will have a better influence on your happiness as opposed to being at a large campus, right? So you have this idea that the size of the group is going to have an impact on how you do socially and academically once you get to college. Right, so those are just three examples. You might have other reasons for why you decided to attend college, but the point is that it's not a decision that just comes out of the blue. And the sociologist's job is to uncover the social factors that influence individual behavior and the way that individuals in turn influence society, right? So while sociologists recognize that people do make choices in their own lives, they also argue that because individuals don't live in isolation, this idea of individualism is a myth, right? Instead, sociologists are emphasizing the ways that an individual's social world is going to have an influence on them. So, you might be taking sociology for the first time, and if so, I just want to give you a brief introduction to the field. So, sociology is the systematic and scientific study of human society and human behavior. So when you're thinking about your life or your world in this way, we like to say that you're using your sociological imagination. And that's just basically another way of saying that you're using a sociological lens to view the world that you live in. So this term sociological imagination was first used by this guy C. Wright Mills in 1959. He's probably one of the most famous sociologists, certainly the most famous of the 20th century. There's lots of older dead dudes who are sociologists as well, and we'll talk about some of those. But he is famous because he's made a lot of important contributions to the discipline of sociology, obviously, but also like maybe a little bit because he has this legacy of sort of being a badass. Like he was a football player, and you can see him here. He's riding his motorcycle to work. So anyway, what C. Wright Mills was talking about when he wrote the book that you read from is that sociologists don't just see individual problems, right? So a sociologist sees a person's life as being connected to the social world that they live in, as well as the historical period that they live in. And this part's pretty important. So in this sort of vein, Mills distinguishes between what he calls private troubles and public issues. Private troubles are things that happen to a specific individual, and they're going to be solved within that individual's immediate social environment. So you could think of this maybe as like this is an argument with somebody that that you live with, like somebody in your family or your spouse. In contrast, public issues come about when many people experience a similar problem as a result of patterned and interacting social environments. So basically, what he means is that there are historical and social conditions that have an influence on not just one person, but lots of people, and that bring about a particular kind of problem for a lot of people. So when this happens, the solution to the problem lies at the level of society rather than at the level of the individual. So he gives a couple of examples that you should be familiar with from the reading. So he talks about unemployment, right? Like a private trouble would be one person loses their job, but the public issue is when the economy changes in such a way that many people lose their jobs and have a hard time finding a new job. That would be unemployment. And so the solution can't be at the individual level for all those people, but perhaps at the social level with some kind of job training program, or the economy picks back up again, or some kind of like stimulus from the government, something like that. He also talks about war and marriage and problems in urban areas as being examples of public issues. So I'll give you two more examples. The first you might consider is the presence of women in colleges and universities. So women in our class, and there are probably a lot of you probably would not be here if this class took place 60 years ago. And certainly I would not be teaching this class 60 years ago. But we live in a historical period where female college enrollment and graduation rates are actually higher than for males. And this change happened over time, over a period of probably the last, probably started about 40, 50 years ago. And that change is related to other social changes that were happening. So, for example, in the 70s, right, you started to see um, this movement for women to have more civil rights. And so that means um, women were more likely to be in the workplace. That was also a result of a changing economy that meant that a single income was not enough for a married couple to sustain their household anymore. And many women, although there were many women who were already working outside of the home, um, more women started to go into the workplace because they needed the extra income for their families. So that was one reason that women started going back to college or going to college, because women were increasingly entering the workplace. But also women began to put off marriage to pursue careers. And that's something that is probably you see most happening in the last like 30 to 40 years. And so as a result of that, women deciding that they wanted to have a career before they start a family, you see a lot more women going to college than ever before. The second sort of public issue that you might think of as opposed to a private trouble would be this increasing tendency for young people to live with their parents, right? So you might think when you graduate college, I'm going to move back with my parents and sort of save some money and start my first job. And then once I have a little bit of a cushion, then I can sort of go out into the world, maybe buy a house. This was sort of stigmatized for a long time, but the world is much different now. So in 2016, 15% of millennials were living in their parents' homes, which is a higher rate than for any previous generation. And there's a link to this study on Blackboard. So why is this? Well, you have to think of the economic conditions that college graduates are facing, which I'm sure many of you are thinking about. The job market is increasingly competitive, and it's super expensive to buy a house. So although maybe 30, 20 years ago, it probably was very looked down upon or frowned upon to move back home with your parents. It was sort of seen as like a sign of failure, maybe. Now it's becoming increasingly common, and the stigma is becoming less because we've placed an increased importance on finding the right career path, and a lot of people are okay with taking the time to do that. And so if you have family, if you are fortunate enough to have family who are able to take you in and help you, help support you while you're doing that, that is something that many millennials are that's an option that many millennials are taking. And then you can sort of get even further into that and think about like, well, maybe there are families who can't afford to support their children who are coming home from college or who might need to move back home. And so then you think about sort of how that inequality might further influence people down the road. So that's sort of like how the sociologist's mind is working. So let's switch really quick to just giving you a brief look at the history of medical sociology and how this sort of came about as a field within sociology. So early sociologists, and here we're talking sociologists like in the mid-1800s, they were focused mostly on social institutions. So again, things like the economy, religion, education, the family, occupations. You have people like Karl Marx, who you may have heard of. Karl Marx focused on capitalism and the economy. There was another sociologist named Max Weber, also from Germany, who studied the economy, and he also studied religion and bureaucracy. And then there's a guy named Emile Durkheim, who was from France, and he was also interested in capitalism and religion and how those things influenced human behavior. In particular, in what is probably his best known work, he actually looked at how a society's characteristics influenced its suicide rate. So there's a link to a short video about his book on suicide on Blackboard that you are required to watch for this week's module. And so that will give you a little more context. But his work on suicide is the earliest example of what we now know as medical sociology, which is the term that we use to talk about the sociological study of health, illness, healing, and healthcare. And so if you move then into the early 20th century, so like the early 1900s, most of the research on health was actually being conducted by doctors, although there was a little bit of sociological research happening here. Most of it is being done by doctors. And so after World War II, there was a push for more mental health treatment. And in 1949, the National Institute for Mental Health was founded. And this became a key source of funding for research on mental health, and it played a significant role in shaping policies around mental health. And so one of the most important and sort of the first like landmark study stemming from this work on community mental health was a study by two guys named Hollingshead and Redlich, and they did a study of social class and mental illness. And so they were a sociologist and a psychiatrist that pioneered in each of their fields by showing with this small sample of adults from New Haven, Connecticut, that there's a very clear relationship between social class and mental illness. They found that people who are poor are more likely to have mental illnesses and are less likely to receive good treatment or any treatment compared to people who are more affluent. So this seems like common sense to some of us now, but this was a really groundbreaking finding because this research was done at a time when many people believed that if somebody had a mental illness, it was a sign that they had personally or morally failed, that there was something wrong with them as a person, as opposed to connected to a larger system of inequality. And so in 1957, you have a sociologist named Robert Strauss who wrote an article describing this new field called medical sociology. And so he saw this field split into two camps. One he called sociology in medicine, which he said was comprised of sociologists who worked with health professionals across a number of different fields to answer questions about disease or the social factors that influence health and illness. So this line of work is pretty similar to public health, and it can be thought of as being done by sociologists or somebody with a sociological perspective who works within the medical field. So a person in this who's doing sociology in medicine is interested in a particular health issue and wants to understand why someone would suffer from that particular issue. What are the social factors that would cause a person to suffer from that particular social issue? So this sociology in medicine is what we're going to focus on in weeks 2, 3, and 4. In contrast to sociology in medicine, Strauss also talked about sociology of medicine, which is more concerned with what we might think of as the social institution of medicine, right? It's the study of the field of medicine rather than of health and illness. So sociologists of medicine are studying the organization of like the field of medical practice, the relationships between people within the medical field and with patients, the authority that doctors are presumed to have in medical interactions, things like that. So this work is done by sociologists who are outside of the medical field and is what we're going to really see more of in weeks 5 through 10. And so Strauss saw these two branches of medical sociology as being incompatible, but that's not really the case any longer. You don't see people doing exclusively one or the other. So for example, researchers who study the effects of stress from your job and that the influence that has on your health, They also need to understand broader sociological knowledge about the economy and about occupational structures. So this distinction, while it might have been clear when Robert Strauss was writing in 1957, it's much less relevant today. So, what does the sociological perspective look like when we apply it to health, illness, and healthcare? We ask how social forces impact health and illness. And what do we mean by this term social forces? What are the things that sociologists think affect health and illness? So let's consider for a moment how a biologist might study health and illness. They're mainly concerned with what goes on inside the body or immediately surrounding the body. They're focusing on pathogens and germs and viruses and how our bodies function. Sociologists are looking outside the body for clues about why health and illness take on patterns in society, right? So we are not concerned with George's sickness, right? We want to understand why people who have George's sickness have George's sickness, and if there's something that is common about the way that people live their lives or the kinds of environments they find themselves in that might contribute to all of those people having that particular illness. So you want to think about C. Wright Mills here again. We're not looking at one individual's health trouble, but now we're looking at health and illness as patterned and how do they become larger public issues. So what I want to use to frame this course across the term, we'll revisit this ecological model. It helps us visualize a sociological perspective on health and illness. Certainly, health is influenced by what happens at the individual level, but we are embedded in many different layers of social organization. So if you look at the smallest circle, you'll see this is the individual. So these are things like, what do we know? What kind of attitudes and perceptions do we have about the world around us? What kind of behaviors do we exhibit? What do we think about ourselves, like our self-concept? How do we think about ourselves? What kind of skills do we have? And what has our sort of developmental trajectory been up to this point? That's all sort of like contained within the individual. But that circle, you can see, is a subset of the four larger ovals around it, which the model is intended to signify that each of those layers has an influence on the things that we know, the attitudes we have, how we behave, what we think of ourselves, our skills, and our development. So we are embedded in this larger system of social factors. At the interpersonal level, you have things like your social support network, right? Your interpersonal relationships and support systems. These are things like family, friends, the people that you work with, anybody that you have around you, any of the people that are around you, and what the relationships are between you and those people. So then at the organizational level, this is where you see social institutions, things like schools, workplaces, places of worship. So these are all social institutions, and what's really emphasized at the organizational level is the environment of those social institutions. So not the broader like community environment, not the culture of America or anything broad like that. This is much more constrained to a particular set of social institutions. So think about, like, for example, North Central College is your school, and probably for many of you, your workplace. The environment of North Central College, the rules, the formal rules and the informal rules. There's lots of norms that are in place at North Central that are not codified as like specific rules in the student handbook. The structure of the campus and the structure of the relationships between the people there. There's an environment that's particular to North Central College, and North Central is one part of the larger institution of education. So that is really what you want to think of here. Like, what are the rules and what's the structure, physical structure, the sort of like regulatory structure of these social institutions that you spend your lives in. Then at the next layer is the community level. So in addition to being part of interpersonal networks, in addition to being embedded in this organizational layer, we're also part of communities, local communities, regional communities, national communities. Our communities influence us and our well-being through their cultural values and norms in the way that they are designed to provide access to spaces and resources, whether they provide the opportunity to connect with other people and organizations, as well as the connections between organizations. You want to think about, like, are communities densely connected? Do people like interact with each other a lot? Or are they sparsely connected? Like, there's really not that much interaction between the people and organizations in this community. And then the highest level of this ecological model is the public policy level. And you can think about public policy as being at the local, state, and national level. So this is where you would see the laws and policies that either constrain our behavior, like say that we can't do things, or they enable our behavior, saying we can do things from a legal point of view. So if we return to this question of how social forces get under our skin, sociologists would argue that they do so in three main ways. So one is through the likelihood of health and illness. In other words, who is most likely to get sick or stay healthy, and why? What are the social determinants of health and illness? Second, what effects do health and illness have on patients' lives? So this means, what is the experience of illness like? And similarly, we can look at the experiences of healthcare providers like doctors and nurses. And then also included here is how providers and patients interact with each other. Like, what is the power balance, for example, between a patient and a doctor, or a patient and a nurse? And then third, social forces can include comparing healthcare policies here in the US to other Western countries like European countries or Canada, to see how healthcare legislation influences the nation's health. That would be one example, but to sort of think of like the system as a whole would be another way to think of how social forces impact health. So I'm going to stop here for this lecture. The next lecture will briefly cover some of the main ideas of epidemiology, which is covered in chapter 2 of your book. And then there's a third lecture that will go over a case study that will sort of highlight some of the main ideas of medical sociology and of the ecological model for you. See you then.